right is Marco Mira Dercole. He is the head of the Division for Household Statistics and Progress Measurement at the OECD. Right now, I think they're following the progress of the so-called Sarkozy Commission, and also he's very involved in a Better Living Index, which I know he will tell us more about. And he was kind enough to share this document, How's Life? Measuring Well-Being, with me this morning. So that's something I know all of you might be interested in getting later. Jay Naidu is chair of the board of directors and of the partnership council of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, otherwise known as GAIN. He was formerly South Africa's minister for their reconstruction and development program from 1994 to 1999. I think many of us know him as a student activist, very influenced by Steve Biko, very involved in the trade union movement, and by all accounts, he's an individual held in very high esteem across the continent of Africa and the world.
I think that, in trying to understand the subject before us, I think the core of our challenge of sustainable human development, of human well-being as it's been termed here, or social justice or human dignity that we fought for in our struggle against apartheid, the core of the challenge is politics. It's understanding the politics that makes people treat others as if we do not have the basis of every life being of equal value. And if we don't understand that as the central challenge and obstacle towards delivering human well-being, then we're missing the plot. And that certainly is a big issue that confronts us, that come from the trenches in the developing world, and increasingly in the developed world. And I think that certainly, I think there's a consensus today that we're at a tipping point in history. We really are facing, from 2008, a crisis around food and fuel that threw millions of people into poverty. And that was followed by a financial and economic crisis that again plunged the world into crisis. And if you combine that with an ecological disaster that threatens literally lives of tens of millions of people in the world, and see this current situation, which the papers, I think, provide clear evidence on, is that outside of countries like Brazil and probably China, there's growing inequality and poverty in the world. And in fact, there is a crisis that we face. The challenges that we've understood as a development community in addressing, whether it's health or education or vaccines, is integrally linked to broader challenges that we face of food and nutrition security, of improving agricultural yields, of women's incomes, of the impact of climate change, and fundamentally, the challenge of social justice and human dignity, which is, in a sense, for me, the core of what human well-being is about. We've got to understand that. And part of what we've done is that there's increasing fascination of the development foundations with the supply side, and not enough on the demand side. It's not sexy enough. So yes, everyone wants to develop the latest vaccine to solve malaria, which is really good. But how do we get it to the village? How do we make sure the public healthcare systems of that country is actually supplying it to people who need it? And I think those are two parts of an equation we really need to think about very carefully, and one of the critical components that should come out of this workshop and brainstorm as what are the priorities that we make in the future? What is that framework within which we have to make some pretty tough choices?
The way the OECD has been approaching these issues has been from the statistical angles. Not because I don't agree with you that the politics is the real crux of the issue, but because we think that statistics are important for providing the ammunition that helps to make some of those arguments against those that are a priori against, and so and allows to win some arguments. I think what has been the game changer has been, to some extent, the report of this Stiglitz Commission, which has initiated a range of important initiatives throughout the world. Politicians, so that there was something in the discussions, so that to some extent we may not have been measuring the right things, the things that matter to people, and that addressing this type of gap was something that was important not only for the credibility of statistics, but for the very way democracy works. What really matters is to change people's life, and that way you can make it is through a different type of policies that will have to be based on evidence. And I think it would be an issue for the policies at the level of government, for the programs at the level of NGO, but there will be an issue about providing evidence that those programs and intervention are making a difference to people's lives.
Income inequality is fundamentally important as a statistical term of reference. I really believe that. I was part of the World Advisory Committee to the World Development Report of the World Bank on why do states fail. It's one of the premier reports of the World Bank. And the data that we've collected from there, and the World Bank really exceptionally good at data. Maybe other things they make mistakes in, but data, you give them their dues. Is that if one had to improve income of women, then the reality is that they are twice more likely to be better nourished and 3 times more likely to have their children in school. So we know as a fact, if we support gender rights, if we support the struggle of women for empowerment, for improving their incomes, then it is going to fundamentally have a broader impact on that human well-being of the family, at a household level and even at a country level. So just a nuance on that to say that there are some indicators that are fundamentally important to change the game. Just like in telecommunications, when I was a Minister of Telecoms, and when I asked companies to go into rural areas, they said, no, it's unprofitable. And we use regulation to compel them through universal service obligations to work in rural areas. They came back 1 year later saying, these base stations we put in rural areas have brought us more profit than any other base station we had in urban areas. So the game changer was a prepaid card. The innovation of the private sector and its technology was leveraged through regulation and through policy to produce a result that today 5 billion people in the world have cell phones. So I think that's what we're looking for, is one of those game changers within that we can sort of first finance, and then create a way of leveraging greater investment, particularly from governments, from private sector, from other bilaterals, into changing the game that faces people at a grassroots level.
What is painful for me is that whether it's the Human Development Index or the Wellbeing Index, it all starts with statistics about women. Maternal mortality is about us dying. Illiteracy, and the qualitative indicator is female illiteracy. Access to water is about whether I can feed and clean the family. And yet when the analysis on priorities was given, I kind of missed the conversation around women. How do we ask development actors to listen to the non? Because for me, that is the frustration, is that we know the narrative, and at times we choose not to listen to the non. And that, I think, is one of the deficits in development, is the inability to listen to the non and to act on the non. And for me, that is about gender equality is a critical nexus of the conversation that we have.
I think there's sometimes a mistaken belief that philanthropists have, that they are the motive force for change. Actually, change doesn't come from beautiful chapels and boardrooms like this. It comes from the streets. And in 1976, we had had enough as young students. And we went onto the streets in our millions and said we wanted human dignity and social justice, and we were prepared to die for a revolution to change apartheid. We thought freedom was in the air. They smashed us. And then we realized that really we have to go back to the drawing boards and begin a very painstaking process of building real organization in trade unions, in women, in youth, in students, in civics. And we got to grow the demand around a vision of a South Africa that was free from apartheid and racism. And it took us 18 years before we were able to create a political stalemate that allowed a negotiation to take place that installed Nelson Mandela as the first democratically elected president. And 18 years later, we have the dubious honor of being now number one on the, not number one, the last and the worst on the Gini coefficient of inequality, with growing and persistent poverty, with millions of young people coming out of the education system with very few skills, no jobs, and unlikely in their lifetime to have a job. And so we ask ourselves, where did we go wrong? And I think the critical issue has been the people. People became bystanders in development. We demobilized the motive force of change in the country, which was civil society and social movements. So the type of requirements that modern day philanthropy is putting on civil society is extraordinary. It's like, before you can take up social justice or corruption, give me your business plan. But I've got to hire a consultant who charges in dollars to write up the business plan that meets some requirement there. I think that fundamentally, at one level, global philanthropy is failing.
So I understand your view, and we've talked about it before, on sort of the challenges that have evolved over the last 15 years around data and statistics. If you had the 20 CEOs of the biggest foundations in the world in a room, and you could tell them 2 prescriptive things to do, you know, how would you change this? I mean, how do you change the trajectory? Feels like that's sort of the core of the question.
Yes, I would put to them this issue of the supply and demand side, because I think a lot of new philanthropy is not really interested in the demand side. It's too complicated, it's too political, they don't believe in the equation of their success that politics played a role. So I think one important thing I would say to them, in fact, if we want to see game change on a massive scale, you have to strengthen grassroots organizations through advocacy, through social justice, human dignity, through putting human well-being at the center of your grant giving and of your policy and strategy. So that's the first thing I would make to them. The second thing I would say is that development cannot be a linear process. In fact, the politics of development have confounded some of the brightest and best brains we've had for decades. And it's not going to be an overnight solution in America. It's a slow process, it requires patient capital, and it's how do we use our capital in the sense of what Heather has said, as first risk capital to leverage broader changes that, particularly in the countries where we want to deal with poverty and inequality to a large extent, government is the biggest player. And how do we do that in a way that also empowers opportunities for entrepreneurs from a grassroots level? You know, like I saw in Kibera, the M-Pesa money transfer system. It's ordinary people, many illiterate, that are harnessing the latest technology, because you don't need to know how a cell phone works, but you can use a cell phone. And how do we use, what are those game changers that we need to support that scale up a different paradigm for the people that we want to address as our constituency? Those would be the 2 issues.